Our next speaker is going to be virtual. He's recovering from the flu. So I apologize again for my speaking here, but we're going to switch over to the video link in a few seconds. It's weird to hear yourself talk. I'm Tony Andrade. I am the past president of the Oregon chapter. Also has been is an acceptable title. I have the honor of introducing our next speaker, Stuart Newsome. He is the VP of RCM Insights at Infinx, hosts Office Hours, a weekly thought leadership series spotlighting real-world change in healthcare revenue. Thanks for bearing with me. Through candid conversations with industry experts, he explores the evolving relationship between human expertise and technology across patient access, compliance, and automation. I did learn on his LinkedIn website that he is a passionate podcaster, something he has in common with Jeff Johnson and his podcast. I also have a podcast, so I'm passionate about it also. So I'm excited to hear more about that. So Stuart Newsome, please join me in giving him a warm welcome. And hopefully we'll see him in a second.
Okay, great. So first, I want to say thank you. Thank you to Evan for inviting me to join you all here at Oregon HFMA Winter Conference. I was very much looking forward to being there in person. But as Taylor said earlier, unfortunately, I caught the flu this week. And while I would have loved to power through it, which I'm certainly capable of doing that, I'm guessing none of you really want what I've got right now. So this is probably the safer option for everyone involved. I also want to thank Devin for helping coordinate all the technical hoops that made this pivot possible, adjusting from in-person to virtual, even though there's some folks listening remotely as well. It's still, doing this at the last minute is never really simple. I know there's always technical difficulties, so I appreciate the flexibility and patience from the entire Oregon HFMA. So I truly do wish that I was there with you, though. There's something different about being in the room together, especially for a topic like this. But we'll make the most of it in the format that we have. I do like to have interaction. I know we're going to be limited with that here, but with that, there will be any questions and answers at the end. Perhaps we can do it through Q&A chat or whatnot. But there'll be contact information for me at the end that you can actually contact me afterwards if that's not possible. So again, apologize for that. Also, if I press mute, it's because I'm coughing. I don't want y'all to suffer through that. So I still am feeling a little weary, but I'm going to power through it. And speaking of formats, I want to briefly acknowledge another audience that's joining us today. This session is also being simulcast as part of our weekly Office Hours webinar series. And just this session alone, not the whole conference. So for those of you joining through Office Hours, welcome. I'm Stuart Newsome, and I'm your host for Office Hours each week. Today, we're coming to you live alongside the Oregon HFMA Winter Conference to discuss change at the speed of augmented intelligence. So if you're joining virtually, one quick technical note, the simulcast sometimes softens the audio slightly. So if I sound a little distant at any point, just make sure your volume is turned up. For everyone here through Oregon HFMA and for those joining through our Office Hours, I'm glad you're here. We've never done anything like this before, so the plan was for me to be live and still broadcast live from there. So a neat concept, but we're doing it this way, so we'll make do. This topic is one that has been building over time through conversations, through experience, and through listening, and that's exactly where I'd like to begin. So first of all, I just want to spend a little time to explain why this session exists in the first place. This topic didn't start as a presentation idea. It really started as a conversation. And it was a conversation between me and Evan when he asked me to join you folks. And he had an idea about using the conversations and interviews that I have, had with industry experts and clients on our weekly webinar called Office Hours, and discuss maybe some common themes around change. And as he and I were talking about the sheer number of Office Hours episodes that have accumulated over time, we both realized that Infinix unintentionally built a pretty extensive archive of how revenue cycle management has evolved, not in hindsight and not through some theory, but in real time, based on conversations with people actually living inside these changes. And that led to a real simple question. What if we step back and listen to our own content? Not to repeat it, not to repackage it, but to look for patterns. What keeps coming up over and over again? What keeps people up at night over and over again? What has truly changed? And just as importantly, what hasn't changed? So I went back and pulled some of the conversations that resonated the most, not necessarily episodes with the biggest audiences, but the ones that generated the strongest reactions, the most follow-up questions, the ones where we got emails and messages back saying, this is exactly what we're dealing with. So that's where this session really took shape. For those of you who aren't familiar, Office Hours is Infinix's weekly webinar series. The important thing to understand about it is how topics get chosen. We don't sit around in a room and decide what we want to talk about that week. Each session is inspired by real client conversations, prospect discussions, layered with broader industry trends and even some regulatory pressures that we're hearing about out there. In other words, the content is intentionally reactive. It's designed to reflect reality as it's unfolding, not an individualized version of how revenue cycle should work. So perhaps this wasn't unintentional at all, but intentional to really create a map in time of evolution of change in RCM. Now, we don't stop there. Every Office Hours episode is also repurposed into our podcast, Revenue Cycle Optimized. Now, on top of that, we produced 2 additional podcast episodes every week. One that leans more heavily into industry expertise and analysis, where we use the voices of certain subject matter experts that are cut into fit maybe a 20 or 30-minute segment. And then we have another shorter segment that I like to call RCM Minutes that focuses on applied real-world lessons coming directly from client experiences. So again, the formats are different, but the input is always the same. It's all centered around the conversations that we're having with our clients and our prospects. Now, these conversations with revenue cycle leaders, they're with operation teams, with compliance experts, with people trying to make sense of the mounting complexity while still keeping the lights on. So when I say there's a lot of content to choose from, that's not an exaggeration. We're constantly listening and producing material based on what we're hearing. And what became clear very quickly is that there is no shortage of material when it comes to change. We could spend hours talking about how things are evolving. Every single episode touches change in some way. But here's the part that really stood out to me. While the topics of change, such as topics that we talked about, is typically AI agents, denials, staffing, document capture, coding, credentialing, compliance, you name it, the underlying challenges feel remarkably familiar. In many ways, the same core problems are still there. RCM is still very complex. RCM is still very fragmented. Payers are going to still behave the way they behave. There's still staffing challenges and strain. There's still a need for visibility. But what has changed is the velocity. So change is happening faster than it used to. There are expectations that are shifting more quickly. Decisions are being made with less margin for error, and AI is clearly leading that acceleration, whether organizations are fully ready for it or not. So this session really isn't about categorizing anything or everything that's changed. It's really about stepping back and asking, well, how is change actually being experienced right now? What patterns keep repeating across these conversations? And what can we learn by listening carefully instead of just reacting? And that's why this session really exists. So I want to slow us down here for a moment because this slide is about something that often gets glossed over. Before change shows up in metrics or dashboards or executive summaries, it shows up in people. And that's where most of these conversations actually begin. And when I'm hosting office hours, recording podcasts, or sitting in on demos and client calls, the first thing that surfaces is rarely a technical problem. It's a feeling, usually a mix of anxiety and fatigue. So there's anxiety about keeping up, not just with AI, but with everything else moving around it. Payers' behavior changes, requirements shift, internal expectations evolve, and it often feels like the goalposts are moving faster than the teams can adjust. There's also fatigue from constant adjustment. And I want to be clear here. This isn't the fatigue that comes from one big project or maybe a tough quarter. It's the fatigue that comes from never quite landing. Workflows change, then change again. Priority shift from the last shift has fully settled. So I hear people saying things like, we finally got comfortable and then it changed again. And that's a very different experience than managing a single transformation. Then there's the fear of falling behind peers, falling behind benchmarks, falling behind what leadership thinks modernization should look like. AI has intensified that fear. Even in organizations that haven't formally adopted it yet, just knowing it's out there changes expectations. But what makes this especially difficult is the uncertainty. Teams are constantly trying to answer the same question. What actually matters most right now? Where should limited time and energy really go? And what's urgent versus what's just loud? Now, for the last several years, artificial intelligence has made a lot of promises. And just about every company is claiming it and stating that they have all the answers, pulling and tugging at that inner FOMO, that complex that we all have. And no wonder that has created such skepticism, because I've spoken with several leaders in the industry about their nightmares and stories of being burned with overpromises and under delivery. Now, when you look at the data, this emotional response starts to make a lot of sense. Across the industry, 5 to 15% of claims are denied due to process and timing gaps. And that's not a reflection of effort or competence. That's a reflection of complexity. And complexity doesn't stay neutral, it creates friction, and it's intentional. At the same time, roughly 25 to 30% of healthcare operating costs are tied up in administrative work. And that's not just a financial number, that's hours, that's attention, that's cognitive load being consumed before anyone even gets to improvement. Now, in conversations with teams, this often comes out in very practical ways. People will say, well, we're doing more work just to keep things from getting worse. Or it feels like we're constantly fixing instead of working or improving things. That's an important distinction. So this isn't resistance to change. It's what happens when change accelerates inside already complex systems without enough clarity or recovery time. And this is why starting here matters, because if you jump straight to solutions without acknowledging how change is actually being experienced, we risk designing improvements that look good on paper but feel overwhelming in practice. So this slide sets the emotional baseline for everything else that we're going to talk about, because change doesn't start in dashboards, it starts in people. So this is the point where I want to pause and start connecting some of the dots. After having all these conversations with clients, prospects, and experts, then taking that content, so to speak, to develop episodes for webinars and podcasts, you eventually stop listening for individual answers and start listening for patterns. You hear the same concerns show up in different language from different roles in different organizations. And that's how these themes emerged. Pattern of the same concerns, anxiety, and challenges. The first one is pace. Change is simply moving faster than it used to. Now, I've been in this business for 30 years, and though changes on technology have always been front of mind, it didn't move very fast. I mean, we're still trying to sort out interoperability, right? But now I have seen some more advancements in technology in the last year than I have at least in the last 5, maybe even 10 years. And not just technology change, but operational change, payer behavior, regulatory expectations, and even medical advancements, all of it. And what we constantly hear from leaders is that the window to react has narrowed. There's less time to absorb, less room to test, and less tolerance for missteps. Now, the second theme is augmented intelligence. And what's important here is that people aren't talking about AI as a concept anymore. They're talking about how it's changing the flow of work. Who touches something first? When decisions get made, where responsibilities sit. AI shows up less as a tool and more as a force that reshapes timing and accountability. It's the orchestration of work between AI agents and human specialists that is starting to hit home. The third theme is staffing, and this is one that comes up constantly. But what's notable is that it's rarely framed as simply, we need more people. What we hear instead is frustration around enablement, teams spending time on rework, highly skilled staff doing coordination work, roles changing faster than training and documentation can keep up. And then there's the ripple effect. Now, this might be the most consistent theme of all. Change almost never stays where it starts. A front-end improvement creates downstream pressure. A denial prevention initiative exposes intake or documentation gaps. Fixing one part of the cycle often highlights strain somewhere else. So what's important to understand is that these themes don't exist independently. They stack on top of one another. Faster pace amplifies staffing strain. Augmented intelligence reshapes workflows, and changes in one area reveals misalignment in another. And this is where a lot of frustration we hear comes from. Leaders often approach change one initiative at a time. A new system here, a new process there, but teams experience it as a system-wide shift that affects everything they touch. So when we talk about these themes, we're not listing problems to solve. We're describing the lenses that which change is actually being experienced. And once you see them this way, it becomes much easier to understand why navigating change feels harder than it used to, even when the intent behind it is good. So going to the next slide, this is the first place where I really want to slow the conversation down, because this theme underpins almost everything else that we're going to talk about. Change in healthcare isn't new. Revenue cycle leaders have always dealt with shifting rules, payer behavior, regulatory updates, and technology evolution. What has changed is the compression. Now, what we hear consistently is that decisions are being made much faster, timelines are even shorter, and initiatives that used to be sequenced are now overlapping each other. Now, in office hours conversations, leaders often describe feeling like they're constantly in motion. One initiative launches before the previous one has fully settled. Training overlaps with go lives. Metrics start changing before teams understand why. A common comment we hear is, we'll stabilize this after the next phase. And then there's another phase, and then another. And this isn't poor planning, it's just a reality of how change is unfolding right now. So one thing I'll add here, and that is this comes directly from our own experience. And that's when change compresses like this. Traditional implementation models break down. We've been pulled into situations where organizations weren't failing because their strategy was wrong. They were failing because everything was happening at once. Intake monetization, perhaps denial pressure, staffing constraints, compliance oversight, all converging on top of each other. And in those moments, what doesn't work is a signal, monolithic solution that assumes stability. What does work is the ability to deploy intelligence in pieces, AI agents that can operate independently, absorb pressure in one area, and not require their entire system to be re-engineered all at once. So we've learned this the hard way. When timelines are short and priorities overlap, solutions have to flex around teams, not the other way around. Otherwise, you just add another initiative to an already overloaded environment. One pattern that comes up repeatedly is overlapping priorities. So organizations might be modernizing intake or addressing denials. Perhaps they're adjusting some of their staffing models and even evaluating some automation, all at the same time. Each of those initiatives makes sense on its own, but the challenge is that the teams are asked to absorb all of them simultaneously. Now, another thing we hear often is that there's less time to pause. And in the past, organizations have had room to pilot, test, adjust, and recover. I know many of you in the room have probably gone through that sequence. And today, the expectation is often to move quickly and figure things out along the way. Doesn't sound like a very good plan. But that creates stress, not because teams can't adapt, but because adaptation without recovery becomes very exhausting. There's also an unevenness to how change lands across the organization. Some teams move quickly, others are constrained by policy, staffing, or legacy systems. When one part of the revenue cycle accelerates and another can't, then friction emerges. We hear this in conversations where leaders say, well, one group is ready to move forward, but another is still catching up. And that mismatch creates a lot of tension, not because anyone is doing something wrong, but because dependencies aren't aligned. Now, another recurring observation is that speed changes expectations. How many of you have heard this? That once something can move faster, there's pressure for everything to move faster. And that pressure often reaches teams before processes are fully ready to support it. Now, in office hours discussions that we have with people, they'll typically say things like, well, once leadership saw that it was possible, the expectation shifted overnight. And that can be motivating, but can also feel destabilizing if teams aren't prepared. So what's important to recognize is that absorption always lags adoption. Organizations can decide to change quickly, but people and processes need time to catch up. When absorption lags too far behind adoption, then fatigue sets in. Not dramatic burnout all at once, but a slow erosion of confidence. Teams start feeling like they're always reaching, rarely catching up. And one of the reasons we now think so much about absorption is because we've watched teams try to absorb too much too fast. And the result is almost always the same: confidence erodes before results show up. That's why the way intelligence enters a workflow matters as much as the intelligence itself. If it can't be phased, scoped, or adjusted as teams adapt, it accelerates fatigue instead of reducing it. And this is why understanding the pace of change matters so much. Not to slow innovation down, but to be realistic about how much change an organization can truly absorb at any given time. And this theme sets up everything else we'll talk about, because when change accelerates faster than teams can absorb it, every other issue gets amplified. And I want to shift from how fast change is happening to basically how work itself is actually changing, because this is where augmented intelligence becomes very tangible. Now, when people talk about AI and revenue cycle, the conversation often starts in a high level, things like automation, efficiency, scale. But when you listen closely to how teams describe their day-to-day work, the real change isn't speed, it's structure. So what we're seeing is that work is no longer landing in static queues and waiting for someone to touch it. Instead, work is being routed, sorted, and prioritized before a human ever gets involved. One of the reasons we talk so much about orchestration is because we've seen what happens when intelligence is bolted onto a process instead of woven into it. Early on, we watched orchestrations automate pieces of work, document intake, eligibility checks, denial identification, and then struggle because those systems didn't know about each other, and humans became the glue. That experience fundamentally changed how we think about AI agents. An AI agent isn't just a task executor. It's something that understands context, timing, and the downstream impact. It knows when to act and when to escalate and when to stay out of the way. Now, this comes up constantly when we speak to our clients. Teams will describe how their day used to start by opening a work queue and figuring out what to tackle first. Now, increasingly, systems are helping decide what matters most right now. And that's a subtle but significant shift. It means humans and systems are sharing responsibility in a new way. Humans are still accountable for outcomes, but systems are influencing sequencing, timing, and focus. In other words, intelligence is moving upstream. And one pattern we hear repeatedly is that decisions are being made earlier in the process. So missing documentation is identified before a claim is even submitted. Eligibility discrepancies surface before staff invest time in follow-up. Prior authorization requirements are flagged before scheduling even happens. In past workflows, these issues often surface very late, sometimes weeks later, and when the cost of fixing them was much higher. What augmented intelligence is doing when implemented thoughtfully is shifting those decision points forward. And that shift has profound impact on how work feels. Teams often describe this as moving from one reactive to responsive. Instead of discovering problems after the fact, they've been altered while there's still time to intervene. But here's where the conversation gets more nuanced. This doesn't always feel like relief at first. Now, in several office hours episodes, leaders have talked openly about the early stages of AI-enabled workflows feeling noisy, more alerts, more flags, more things being surfaced than teams were used to seeing. We've always learned that the first version of intelligence often feels like too much. More signals, more alerts, more surfaced issues. But what separates productive implementations from frustrating ones is the ability to teach the system what matters. That's where AI agent-based design becomes very critical. AI agents that can learn thresholds, patterns, and priorities instead of treating every exception as equally urgent. That's an important observation. Augmented intelligence doesn't eliminate complexity, it exposes it. And if systems surface issues without context or prioritization, teams can feel overwhelmed rather than supported. And this is where orchestration becomes more important than automation. Automation simply executes tasks faster. Orchestration determines which tasks should happen, when they should happen, and who, whether it's a human or AI agent, should handle them. And we hear this distinction come up often in client conversations. Organizations that focus on automating individual steps sometimes find themselves managing more exceptions, not fewer ones. Organizations that focus on orchestrating workflows across the cycle tend to see more sustainable gains. Now, a common example involves denial prevention. Teams will say that we automated part of the process, but now we're chasing different issues. The automation worked, but without orchestration, the work just shifted instead of improving. Now, another recurring theme is trust. Teams want to understand why something is being prioritized or flagged. When systems provide reasoning, context, and transparency, adoption improves. When they don't, then teams hesitate, not because they don't believe in AI, but because they're accountable for the outcomes. And this comes up especially in conversations with managers and directors. They'll say, well, I'm comfortable letting the system guide work, but I need to be able to explain why it did and why, what it did and why. So we hear managers say that they need to explain why work was prioritized a certain way. And that's not a barrier, it's a design requirement. That's why we've had to build intelligence that doesn't just act, but explains itself. Because if a leader can't defend the decision, they won't trust it, and they shouldn't. That's augmented intelligence in practice. That's not about removing humans from the loop. It's about redefining the loop. So what's also changing is the role of expertise. Highly skilled staff are being asked to spend less time on the detection and more time on judgment, less time finding problems and more time resolving them. In office hours discussions, experienced leaders often say some version of, my best people shouldn't be spending their day figuring out what went wrong. They should be deciding what to do next. And that's the promise of augmented intelligence when it's designed intentionally. But it also requires restraint. Not every decision needs to be automated. Not every signal needs to surface. The goal isn't maximizing intelligence, it's useful intelligence. So when we say augmented intelligence, it's reshaping how work gets done. What we're really describing is a shift in responsibility, in timing, in focus. So work is being reshaped around anticipation instead of reaction. And that shift, when done well, sets the stage for everything else we're going to talk about next, especially staffing and sustainability. Now, I want to spend some real time on this slide because staffing is the issue that comes up more consistently than almost anything else. And it's also one of the most misunderstood. And I'm sure that resonates with many of you in the room. When staffing comes up in conversations, it's easy to frame it as a numbers problem. Not enough people, open roles that are hard to fill, a lot of turnover, and all of that is real. But when you listen closely to what teams are actually saying, a different story kind of emerges. What we hear far more often is not, we don't have enough people, but that the people we have are spending their time on the wrong work. This realization basically is that skilled staff are doing the wrong work. is something we've encountered over and over again. We've sat with teams where the most experienced people were spending their days chasing missing documents, reconciling mismatches, or manually coordinating between systems, not because they lacked ability, but because the system required it. And that's where intelligent agents have been most impactful in our experience. Not replacing people, but removing the friction that forces expertise to be wasted on detection instead of decision making. Cognitive load has increased dramatically. Teams are juggling more pair rules, more handoffs, more technology touch points, and more edge cases than they were even a few years ago. And that load isn't always visible in job descriptions or productivity metrics. One pattern that comes up repeatedly is how much time is consumed by rework and exceptions. Teams will describe spending large portions of the day correcting issues that should have been made at the front end in the first place. Missing documentation, timing mismatches, eligibility discrepancies, even authorization gaps. And this is where frustration really builds. In office hours discussions, we often hear experienced staff say some version of, I spend more time fixing problems than actually doing my job. And that's not a motivation issue, that's a workflow design issue. Another recurring theme is how quickly roles are changing. Expectations for revenue cycle staff have evolved faster than training programs, documentation, and internal support structures. People are being asked to understand more systems, more rules, and more downstream impact, often without additional context or enablement. Managers will say things like, we've trained them on the process, but the process keeps changing. And that creates a constant learning curve with very little plateau. So burnout in this context isn't about people being unwilling to adapt. It's about fragmentation. So when work is broken across too many systems, too many handoffs, and too many exceptions, even strong teams struggle to maintain momentum. One example that comes up often involves highly skilled staff doing what essentially amounts to coordination work, tracking down information, following up across departments, reconciling mismatches between systems. That's not why those roles exist. It's not where expertise delivers the most value. This is why framing staffing purely as a headcount problem misses the mark entirely. You can hire more people into a fragmented system, but all you've done is scale the fragmentation. The workload might feel lighter for a moment, but the underlying strain doesn't disappear. So one thing that we've learned is that burnout is often a signal, not a staffing failure, but a system failure. When AI agents take on the work for monitoring, triaging, and routing, something interesting happens. Staff doesn't just get faster. Their work becomes more predictable. Fire drills decrease. Cognitive load drops. Confidence starts to rebuild. So enablement changes that equation. When workflows surface issues earlier, when priorities are clear, and when systems reduce unnecessary rework, teams can actually operate at the top of their skill set. They spend less time chasing information and more time applying judgment. So we hear this shift clearly in organizations that start to get enablement right. Staff describe their days as more predictable. Managers talk about fewer fire drills. Leaders see more consistency in outcomes. And this connects directly back to augmented intelligence. Now, when systems help identify issues before they cascade, when they route work intelligently, and when they reduce noise instead of adding to it, staffing pressure begins to ease, even without increasing headcount. But when intelligence is layered on without orchestration, the opposite happens. More alerts, there's more exceptions, more things for already stretched teams to manage. So the real question isn't how many people do we need? It's, are we enabling the people we have to do the work the best that they're best at? The most sustainable staffing gains that we've seen didn't come from hiring more people. They came from redesigning workflows so that the intelligence absorbs volatility and humans apply judgment. That's a fundamentally different conversation. And it's one that shows up again and again when we listen closely to revenue cycle teams. Now, this is where all the previous themes kind of come together. One of the most consistent observations we hear regularly is, regardless of specialty, size, or maturity, is that change in the revenue cycle rarely stays where it starts, right? And I'm sure many of you, if I asked you to raise your hand, you'd probably raise your hand and say, I can identify with that. And almost every improvement creates a ripple, and those ripples don't always land where you expect them to. So in office hours conversations, this comes up constantly when teams talk about front end improvements. Organizations modernize intake, or maybe they improve their document capture, or maybe they're accelerating prior authorization. And almost immediately, something else feels the impact. Sometimes it's a good surprise. Maybe some downstream teams are seeing cleaner data. There's fewer missing fields. There's better visibility. But just as often, there's new pressures that emerge. A front-end improvement increases volume moving downstream. AR teams suddenly see more claims entering the system faster than before. Coding teams experience more work compressed into shorter time frames. Denial teams encounter new patterns, not because something broke, but because the workflow changed. What's important here is that nothing went wrong. The system simply revealed its dependencies. So technology has a way of exposing what was previously hidden. When the work actually speeds up in one area, bottlenecks kind of become more visible elsewhere. In slower systems, misalignment can stay masked for years, and in faster systems, it surfaces immediately. So we hear this clearly when leaders say things like, well, we fixed the intake, but now follow-up is struggling, or our authorization process improved, but our downstream teams weren't prepared for the volume shift. Another common example involves denials. Organizations invest heavily in denial prevention, but better analytics, earlier intervention, smarter workflows. And while denials decrease in one category, new patterns emerge in another. And that's not failure, that's just feedback. And then you just need to treat it as feedback. When organizations treat these ripples as failures, they stall. But when they treat them as feedback, they evolve. And that's why AI agent-based approaches matter so much here. AI agents don't just act, they observe. They surface where pressure is building and where workflows are misaligned, giving leaders insight in how change is propagating across the system. The system is telling you where it's still strained. So just listen to it. Fragmentation plays a major role here. And when the revenue cycle is split across too many systems, teams, and handoffs, change amplifies its inconsistency. So one group adapts quickly while another is constrained by policy or maybe some tooling. The gap between them becomes friction. Now, in office hours discussions, leaders often describe this as playing whack-a-mole. Everyone in here ever played whack-a-mole, right? If you go to the fair or the arcade, if you remember those, you fix one issue and another one pops up. That can feel very discouraging, but it's actually a sign that the system is becoming more transparent. What matters is how organizations respond. Some try to isolate change, hoping it won't disrupt other areas. Others recognize that change will ripple and they plan for it. They anticipate downstream effects. They communicate across functions. They adjust enablement and staffing as the workflows shift. We see this most clearly in organizations that treat the revenue cycle as an interconnected system rather than a series of independent functions. And when change is viewed systematically, surprises become signals instead of setbacks. And this is also where augmented intelligence plays a critical role. When intelligence is applied narrowly, it can optimize one area while destabilizing another. And when it's applied with orchestration in mind, it helps manage dependencies across the cycle. So we've heard leaders say, once we could see how work was flowing end to end, our conversations changed. And that visibility allows teams to anticipate ripple effects instead of reacting to them. And one of the reasons we've leaned so heavily into systems-wide organizations is because we've lived the consequences of narrow optimization. We've watched front-end improvements overwhelm downstream teams. We've seen denial prevention shift pressure into coding or AR. And every time the lesson is the same. Intelligence has to understand dependencies, not just tasks. So the takeaway here isn't that change creates problems, is that change reveals relationships. And the faster change happens, the more important it becomes to understand how each part of the revenue cycle influences the other. So this is the point where organizations either start thinking in systems or continue chasing isolated fixes. So we found that once organizations gain invisibility, not just data, but flow, their conversations change. Decisions become responsive instead of reactive. Teams stop playing whack-a-mole and start managing the system intentionally. So next, we're going to talk about compliance. And I want to spend some time here, and not a lot of time. This is going to hopefully be one of the shortest slides. But I want to intentionally keep it in proportion to the rest of the conversation. Compliance has always mattered in the revenue cycle. And that's kind of where I cut my teeth. I'm certified in compliance through AAPC. But what's actually changed is where it sits and how fast it operates. So in many of the conversations we've had over the past year, especially in office hour sessions focused on denials, audits, as well as prior authorizations, it became very clear that payers are no longer relying primarily on manual review. They're using automation and AI to scan, flag, and act on claims at scale. And payers have a lot of data. They have your data and they have your peers' data, even have your competition's data, and they're crunching it all at a much faster rate using AI. What that means in practice is denials are happening much faster. Recoupments are happening earlier. And in some cases, decisions are being made before anyone on the provider side even realizes there's an issue. AI is enabling payers to look for patterns across massive volumes of claims, timing anomalies, documentation inconsistencies, coding outliers. That's not speculation. It's showing up in the data and in the life experience of provider organizations. So what's important here is that this isn't about bad actors. Many of the claims being flagged are legitimate. The issue is that automation changes the rules of engagement. Small gaps that might have slipped through before now surface immediately. And this is where oversight becomes very critical. As providers adopt more automation and intelligence in their side, oversight has to scale with it. You can't automate decisions without being able to explain them. You can't rely on systems without understanding how they're behaving under pressure. In office hours conversations, compliance leaders often emphasize the need for traceability, not just knowing what happened, but why it happened. What data was used? What rules were applied? What assumptions were made? Defensibility in this environment doesn't come from perfection. It comes from visibility, from being able to show how decisions were made and how expectations were handled. Another pattern that we hear is that compliance is moving earlier in the process. Instead of being a retrospective function reviewing what went wrong, it's becoming a proactive discipline. Teams are asking, well, how do we design workflows that reduce exposure before claims ever go out the door? This shift aligns directly with everything that we've discussed so far: faster change, augmented intelligence, staffing enablement, system level thinking. Compliance isn't a separate lane anymore. It's woven into how work gets done. And the organizations that navigate this well aren't the ones trying to slow automation down. They're the ones building a governance and oversight into their workflows from the start. So speed doesn't come at the expense of defensibility. Now, I want to close the content portion of this session by focusing on leadership, not in the abstract sense, but in the practical day-to-day reality of navigating change. One of the biggest shifts we hear leaders grappling with is the realization that change is no longer episodic. It's not a project with a beginning, middle, and an end. It's continuous. Now, how many of you resonate with that? Now, in conversations with revenue cycle leaders, we often hear things like, we used to have time between initiatives, or we used to stabilize before moving on. And that rhythm has largely disappeared. Change is now layered, ongoing, and interconnected. Accepting that reality is very uncomfortable, I know, but it's very necessary. Because when leaders continue to manage change as if it's temporary, teams feel like they're always waiting for relief that never quite arrives. So the next challenge is balancing speed with absorption. We've talked a lot about how fast things are moving, but speed alone isn't the goal. The real work is understanding how much change an organization can actually absorb at one time. So in office hours discussions, leaders who navigate this well often talk about pacing decisions intentionally. They recognize that adoption can happen quickly, but absorption takes longer. They create space for learning, adjusting, and recovery, even when external pressure pushes for faster movement. Another important mindset shift is moving away from designing for perfection. In a rapidly changing environment, perfect processes rarely survive first contact with reality. What matters more is adaptability. Now, I want to say that again, just to be clear, because it just really hits the point home that in a rapidly changing environment, perfect processes rarely survive first contact with reality. And I'm sure that's the case with many of you. So we hear leaders say we need something that works now and can evolve rather than we need to get this exactly right before we move. That doesn't mean lowering standards. It just means recognizing that flexibility is a strength, not a compromise. So this is especially relevant when intelligence and automation are involved. Systems will improve over time. Models will evolve. Workflows will mature. Leaders who expect static perfection tend to get frustrated. Leaders who design for iteration trends to build resilience. Finally, there's the human side of ambiguity. Teams don't just struggle with workload, they struggle with not knowing what's coming up next or what's going on. Ambiguity creates stress when it isn't really acknowledged. Leaders who navigate change effectively tend to name uncertainty instead of pretending it doesn't exist. In conversations with managers, we often hear that simple saying, "We don't have all the answers yet, but here's what we're watching." And that builds more trust than overconfident certainty. Supporting teams through ambiguity means communicating context, not just direction. It means explaining why priorities shift, why decisions evolved, and how feedback is being used. This mindset doesn't eliminate friction, but it changes how friction is experienced. And as change continues to accelerate, leadership isn't about controlling the pace, it's about helping people move through it with clarity, support, and confidence. Now, I hope everyone enjoyed and got something fruitful out of what I just discussed. That's the end of my presentation, but do want to open it up for Q&A. If we could, I don't know if we can do it through opening up the mics or by going through the Q&A session in the chat. But I do want to emphasize that you can look at that QR code and connect with me on LinkedIn. If you do have any questions or comments, you can actually contact me there. I will respond. I do respond to everyone. Also, feel free to visit the Infinix.com, Infinix website at Infinix.com. We have a lot of case studies, articles, blogs, solutions. You can find past episodes of Office Hours on about any other subject you want. We have hundreds and hundreds of episodes out there. And don't forget to catch us on Revenue Cycle Optimized. Please subscribe. And with that, I'll just be quiet and open it up for questions. All right. Well, either everyone is asleep because we're after, or everything was addressed perfectly.
It was perfect. I just heard that in the audience here. Great. Well, thank you again, Stuart. Presentation.
Certainly. And thank you for having me. Wish I was there in person. I really wanted to meet everyone, but perhaps there'll be another time for that to occur.
Great. Thank you.